A lot's been happening in the news in recent days. There was the awful attack in Nottingham. Uh, there's been a scattering of depressing crime news across the country. I don't think it was a terrorist attack. I think the information suggests that the attacker had mental health problems. That's an issue about how he fell through the system. The issue of terrorism, incidentally, it's very, very important to understand that class as a terrorist act needs to be ideologically motivated. If you have someone who's mentally unbalanced, they're not necessarily seeking a specific ideological agenda in their violence. So I think what happened in Nottingham would be best described as a spree killing, as opposed to ideological terrorism. But awful nonetheless. I watched a speech by the two fathers of the two students who were killed, and it was moving stuff. Um, And of course, there was a third victim. He's been named as Ian Coates, who is, I believe, a construction worker. Horrendous for their families. Um, but this video is not about that. It's about the passing of Silvio Berlusconi and the issues around his sort of leadership. Now, Berlusconi was sort of preceded a whole host of populist type figures that we've seen all over the world. I'm not saying that he was unique, but I think his brand of politics definitely stood out at that time in the 2000s. He definitely stood out among the other G8 leaders at the time. Even Putin then was not the Putin he is today in the same way. I mean, I think Putin's always been a tyrant, but I'll show you a book I read at university back in '06. This is by Tobias Jones, The Dark Heart of Italy. This is kind of an exploration of contemporary Italy, and it focuses heavily on Berlusconi. There's no question about it. Silvio Berlusconi was a colourful character, and biographically speaking, a very interesting character. The Times had a big double-page obituary. They certainly wouldn't do that with every Italian premier. You know, Italy changes government almost every year, although given the state of British politics, we're not exactly in a position to lecture on that score. But Italy and Japan, have had more prime ministers than any other than the other G8 countries. But Berlusconi stood out. He was in power as prime minister for over 7 years, which is a very long time by Italian standards. Um, the most dominant Italian politician by far since Mussolini, and arguably as controversial. Um, I'm not going to praise Berlusconi. I think he is. I cannot praise someone who is a friend of Putin. I just can't bring myself to do that. And for all the talk of he made Italy great, I think many Italians are disgusted by these eulogies to him. He had a state funeral, or at least a large scale funeral. I don't know if it was a full scale state funeral, but a large scale funeral in Milan. Of course, his hardcore supporters were there, but I think many Italians are genuinely disgusted. One of his many controversial statements over the years, after the Aquila earthquake, in I think it was 2016, or 2014, but anyway, major earthquake. Berlusconi's attitude to the survivors was, imagine you're on holiday. I don't know if that was attempted at some sort of morale, but that's typical of the man, vulgar, utterly, utterly in bad taste. This was a man who was a septuagenarian having relationships with young girls, which in most other countries would be seen as predatory behavior. This was a guy who, whilst most Western democratic leaders saw Putin for what he was, Berlusconi had the gall to blame Ukraine for their own suffering, which I think is disgusting. Um, he's not unique in that sense. Germany's Gerhard Schröder is also a Putin lackey. Um, and there's a few other examples. But, Silvio Berlusconi basically epitomized sleaze and corruption. So why did he get away with it? How is it that this guy could be elected 3 times in a country like Italy, a great Western democracy? It's hard to fathom. It really is hard to fathom. And I wonder, is it because he was a character? He was colourful. He was sort of a self-made man, you know, he was a multi-billionaire. He was Trump before Trump in many ways. Um, he had more legal cases than probably any other Western politician. Um, so you know, all of this is like, where is the appeal there? And I wonder, is it because for demagogues like Berlusconi, to their supporters, the appeal actually lies in the fact that they really don't give a damn. You know, to others, they're vulgar, they're a threat to democracy, but to their supporters, they're outside the system. They defy the system, and it's that defiance. I think actually many of the supporters probably know deep down that Berlusconi was corrupt, but it's almost like in their mind he's a lovable rogue. Um, I don't see it that way. I just don't think it's a joke when you're, you know, the leader of a country. Um, but if we look at other examples around the world, Trump, of course, needs no introduction. He was indicted in Miami today, you know, again, his supporters out in force. Um, There'll be a lot more to say about Donald Trump, so I'm not going to dominate this video with him. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. Scenes in January this year were very reminiscent of what happened in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago. You know, hardcore Bolsonaro supporters storming the Brazilian um, political government buildings. India, Narendra Modi, you know, who rails with nationalist fervor, and the BJP again, you know, I think, I personally think he's a threat to Indian democracy. I think this is a concerning time for India's minorities. And I know his supporters will fiercely deny this and say there's still free speech and, you know, you can freely criticize him and so on. But if he had his way, that would not be the case. I think Modi is a very shady figure. Um, in Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, you know, he's just been re-elected. He's moved Turkey further to the east. He's basically an Islamist. Putin, you know, probably the most dangerous man in the world, needs no introduction. Again, like Trump, just there's just so much to say that I'm not going to dominate the video with him. But looking around the world, in Hungary, Viktor Orban, even in Britain, on some level, Boris Johnson. Johnson's perhaps a little bit less controversial than the others, but nevertheless, certainly by British standards, he is a pretty divisive figure. Um, and you know, he's been spouting off this week about it being a witch hunt to his supporters. He could do no wrong, to the likes of Nadine Dorris and others. He could do no wrong. The good news in British politics is some of the destabilising forces. This was a piece in the Times, actually. I forget who the columnist was, but yeah, three destabilising forces in British politics: Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon, and going a little bit further back, Jeremy Corbyn, are all gone. I think that's good news for British politics because they were destabilising forces. You know, earlier this year, The Spectator had an interesting cover which showed Rishi Sunak kind of surrounded by the ghosts of Liz Truss and Boris Johnson in British politics. Sunak's the Prime Minister, you know, he's the man at the top, yet so much coverage is from Boris Johnson. It's a little bit like in America. Joe Biden's the president, it's Biden's time, yet so much news is dominated by Donald Trump. Um, where else can we see examples of this sort of populism? And I think in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos. You know, this is a guy whose father was one of the world's most notorious dictators, whose family was widely accused of basically stealing from a very poor country. You know, Imelda Marcos and her famous shoe collection, you know, whose regime used torture. And of course was swept away in the People Power Revolution. If you know anything about Philippine history, in 1986, yet, you know, decades on, his son gets elected. Now, I'm not suggesting it wasn't democracy. He was comfortably elected. He didn't bother showing up to the presidential debates. Unlike his father, he's lied about a lot of his record. You know, he lied about his record at Oxford, for example. But try telling one of the supporters this, and it will be this, you know, ultra nationalistic response of, you know, you're an outsider, you don't know. But I know many Filipinos personally who are concerned. But it is what it is. So my question is, where's the line between a strong leader who listens to the people and that sort of populism versus a demagogue and a wannabe dictator? Now, of all of these characters that I've named, with the exceptions of Putin and one or two others, they've all been within the context of multi-party democracies. India is a democracy. Italy is a democracy. United States is a democracy, at least on paper, in the sense that they're multi-party systems. It's not like a country like China where it's obviously a dictatorship, but that's just a given. It doesn't matter who's Chinese president. At the moment, it happens to be a particularly powerful president in Xi Jinping, but Hu Jintao was a dictator. So was Jiang Zemin. It is what it is. It's a dictatorship. In democracies, it's somewhat more concerning in the sense that you expect it in China. You know, you expect it in Iran. You expect it in countries that are really they've always been authoritarian states, at least for a very long time. But when you get it in countries like the United States, Italy, and the Philippines, I mentioned because it has been a democracy since 1986. How is it that I often wonder, Filipinos who were tortured under Marcos Sr., how do they feel about the fact that his son is now in power? His son has exonerated his father's record. Um, but I'm an outsider. What do I know? Um, but I don't think it's enough to say, oh well, their supporters are idiots. Trump supporters, Bolsonaro supporters, Marcos supporters, you name it, Berlusconi supporters, because it doesn't. Whether it's true or not, firstly, that would only breed resentment among their supporters, because then they could just pigeonhole people like me as liberal elites. Here's the thing: I'm actually populist myself in some ways. I mean, my views on crime, for example, I would definitely shake up the system there. In this country, I would definitely inject a major dose of reality into the system. I would really shake it up. And I'd probably be described as a demagogue for some of my views on crime and the British justice system. Um, so I'm not anti-populist at all, but I do see the obvious problem when you get this personality cult around any leader, and they could be on the hard right or the hard left. But when you see that sort of personality cult, it's dangerous because then there's a lack of critical thinking. And it's like any legitimate criticism of the individual concerned is met with this really fierce pushback, almost like the person cannot be criticized, it cannot be questioned. It's very, very unhealthy. The nearest equivalent we have in Britain right now is with Boris Johnson. The way I see it is 220,000 Britons died during the pandemic, thereabouts, depending on how you see the death certificates, but let's say thereabouts, it was a hell of a lot of people. Now, at the height of the pandemic, rules imposed by Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and other leading conservatives were very strict. The biggest infringement on civil liberties since, well, in a century, basically. And I'm not sure even the 1918 pandemic had those sort of restrictions. I don't think it did, in fact. Um, I remember a case of a student who held a party and he was fined £10,000. £10,000. Um, so the big problem I have with the Tories right now, at least the Johnsonite faction of the Tories, is this mentality of, well, he delivered Brexit, so he can't be criticised. What I find insufferable about the Tory party is this arrogance of power. This idea that it's one rule for Tory ministers and another rule for everyone else. That really infuriates me. And I think there's this attitude, as long as they deliver, they can do what they want. So, if they're an effective minister, then, oh, well, who cares if they break a few laws here and there? Now, that's a recipe for corruption. In terms of corruption index, Britain is not, we are not too bad, but That isn't something we could be complacent about. If you look at an international ranking, Britain is fairly clean compared to some international rankings. We cannot be complacent. In fact, it was the Italian author of Gomorrah, about this was done in the 2000s. He was assassinated actually, and he investigated the mob in Italy. He actually said that Britain was a very corrupt country. Now, at the time, I dismissed that, but we can't be complacent. We can't be complacent um, because the way the Tories behave these days, it's like, and their supporters, it has to be said, whenever there's an investigation into Tory wrongdoings, oh well, it's a witch hunt. It's the blob out to get them. What I don't like about the left is the wokeness and the identity politics. But honestly, right now, I'm not enthusiastic about anyone because if we look at the main parties, and I'm going to close with this, Tories, like I say, I think there's an arrogance of power. I think that they are pretty corrupt at the moment. Sunak promised to clean up government. I'm not sure that he has. How many chances, for example, is Suella Braverman going to get? But she's anti-woke and she's tough on immigration, so that ticks the boxes. Um, Labour, recently Starmer and Rayner have spoke tough on crime, very good, but they're still woke, unquestionably still there. And I'm not convinced that the tough on crime rhetoric is genuine. I'm not convinced about it. The Lib Dems are almost non-existent. Ed Davey doesn't know what a woman is. He thinks that there's thousands of women in the UK who have penises. I'm sorry to be blunt about it, but that to me is it's not a trivial issue actually. It's something that shows where a leader's thinking is. Um, the Greens are the Greens. I just take them seriously. They're a mouthpiece for Just Stop Oil. Um, I've heard Caroline Lucas is going to step down. Well, goodbye, Caroline Lucas. I really won't. You know, it's whatever merit she had as a politician. The fact of the matter is, ultimately, she was representative of a protest party, and she happened to be lucky that she got elected in Brighton Pavilion. But with her gone, that's it. And as for the SNP, well, that's the SNP. They're all about Scottish nationalism. Right now, I'm kind of in a political wilderness. I honestly, in the general election, I'm a swing voter. I'd think about voting for Labour, but Starmer would really have to prove to me that A, he's distanced himself from woke thinking, and I'm not convinced that he has, and B, he's genuinely tough on crime, and a lot of C actually. He is prepared to talk about radical Islam. So far, he's been PC on that. He's failed to really, really address that issue. I mean, he's perhaps better than Corbyn, but an example of this is the Quran damage incident in Wakefield not long ago. Now this may seem like nitpicking. It may seem like one thing, or what by the grand scheme of things, Nathan, but I do think it is very important in terms of where does a leader's ideology lie. Now, to get back to the gist of this video, Silvio Berlusconi and populism, I think populists emerge when there's a perception. I've always argued this, where there's a perception that so-called mainstream politicians are not listening, or mainstream establishment in this country. What is that? It's the BBC, it's the judiciary, it's institutions. I am adamant, I'm convinced, I'm passionate about the belief if institutions do not listen to people, that will breed populism. This is a no-brainer. And rightly or wrongly, that will happen. That doesn't mean I like demagogues. All these characters I've named, I don't like any of them. But I understand why they have got popular. I get it. I can see, I mean, okay, maybe I'm contradicting myself here because at the start of the video I said I don't understand it. But if we compare Silvio Berlusconi to some other Italian prime ministers, they're typical bureaucrats. They're boring, they're very conventional, they're very pro EU, they're just very sort of predictable. Silvio Berlusconi, on the other hand, is character. And there's a very simplistic, dare I say, parochial sort of thinking with that sort of figure. Trump is the same, Bolsonaro is the same, and Narendra Modi. I'm not saying, by the way, each of these characters are exactly alike. There will be nuances, there will be some differences, but there are certain characteristics that are similar. Um, but you know the saying, one man's populism is another man's listening to the people. Well, I'm populist when it comes to crime, but I'm also an internationalist. I would not want a sort of jingoistic, inward-looking UK. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. Let me know your thoughts. Where is the line between populism as in listening to the people versus populism as in demagoguery? Where's the line there?